strategy of denial. I know that's come up a lot today, and thanks again for the copy. It was one of the first meetings I had in that early basement office in the Senate when you came and saw me a few years ago. But you talk about the importance of coalitions and maintaining a regional balance of power. So if a coalition's too small, it lacks influence. If it's too big, it may lack commitment from the members. So what does an optimal coalition look like to maintain the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, thank you very much, Senator. You're very kind. And that's something, as you may recall, I discussed in my book a lot. I think we actually are in pretty good shape in terms of the formal security commitments, apropos of my discussion with Senator Cotton, I think, and the chairman as well. You know, we have very strong alliances with Japan, South Korea, the Philippines. I think we have effectively a very strong security relationship with Taiwan. Of course, Australia is very strong. And then I think we have a very deepening and important relationship with India that's directly proximate. I think we also could build effectively on a partnership with Vietnam. Obviously, we have a long and kind of fraught history with Vietnam, but the Vietnamese, say what you will, they're committed to defending themselves, and they see, I think, the challenge from China. So I think those are some of the places where we can work. I think if we can kind of hold the line at that way, that's would be an effective model going forward. And then, of course, there are ways at the diplomatic level and political level to use mechanisms like the Quad to build on that. But from a defense point of view, I think the defense perimeter along the first island chain is the one that makes the most sense.
Thank you.
But if you look at what he himself has said—
Can I ask you a quick question?
Sure, yeah.
Do you think that China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea are working in concert against us to present this multilateral challenge against us so that we won't fight back? So how do you justify taking your eye off,
Senator,
off the ball anywhere?
It's arithmetic with respect, Senator.
Right. First of all, your answer to that question was yes. And now you're elaborating on that answer.
Yes, Senator.
Again, I hear much slower than you two talk.
My apologies. Would you like me to continue, Senator?
Yes, if you would elaborate on your affirmative answer to that question.
Yes, Senator, I do believe there's a counter coalition that is working as active. And I know the Chairman, you talked about this extensively. But again, the factual predicate that I think we all must proceed from is that, as the 2022 National Defense Strategy said, we have a one-war military in change. We don't have a military that's capable of fighting four adversaries at the same time. I would like, in theory, in principle, to have such a, but that's not the reality. I believe, especially because the threat is so acute and so realistic, and because of the very real possibility of multi-front war, we must have a realistic plan. And I feel a special obligation that, if confirmed, I must deliver a strategy that actually deals with that. That's not neglecting the Iran threat. That's not neglecting the military threat that Russia poses, but it is a realistic plan to deal with that. And part of that, of course, is greater defense investment and revitalization of our defense industrial base, but it's also making intelligent use of our allies, and in particular, in the case of Europe and countries like Japan and Taiwan, pressing them to take greater responsibility, which they can and must do.
What does, in your role, hopefully your new role here, could you elaborate on what that prioritization, how that would play out, how you think about these things? Because the truth is, if you have a strained industrial base, if you're building things for a land war in Europe, you might be neglecting long-range fires in the Indo-Pacific, right? So how do you view all this?
Well, thanks very much, Senator, and obviously really an honored and very similar perspective as yours. And I would say that I think, and I talked about this in my responses to my advanced policy questions, this so-called Lippmann gap, named after the famous journalist Walter Lippmann, who talked about, the danger of a gap between what you're aspiring to do and what you actually can do. And if you get that bluff called, that's catastrophe. And I feel, again, and forgive me for getting a little emotional about it, but I feel we are at the precipice. I think the President is exactly right. And Mr. Chairman, I think you're absolutely right that we could be at the precipice not only of a major war, God forbid, with China itself, but by deduction of a multi-front war, and we do not have the capacity. And I don't luxuriate in that limitation. I would like to get, as you say, Senator, to a position, and we've spent a lot of time in this hearing, and I spent a lot of time saying, let's do the things necessary, Mr. Chairman, as you've talked about, to get us out of the situation, not only for our own forces, but to supply our allies. But what I've found a difficult challenge is I feel there's a kind of recognition in one part of the collective brain of the American system that this is a reality, but the behavior hasn't actually adapted yet. And what I fear is if we don't have a realistic plan, that the worst could happen, and we could find ourselves in the worst possible outcome, like losing a war. And that's why I mentioned it in my opening statement, because I think, God forbid, that is actually plausible, and I want to avoid that at all costs. And by the way, I also don't want to abandon the Middle East. I don't want a nuclear Iran. I don't want Russia to run roughshod over Europe. I don't want North Korea to take over South Korea. But if we know as a factual, empirical matter that we can't do all those things at even remotely concurrent timelines, don't we need to have a credible plan for how to do so? And I think part of that is greater resources, Mr. Chairman, as you've advocated for, and I think that, in the reconciliation, hopefully that will be part of that reindustrialization, but also the secret sauce, I think, Senator Sullivan, as you were saying, is our allies, and they can do more, and they have done more. I mean, Japan is an incredibly wealthy economy. I mean, Taiwan, look at the investments the president got for TSMC yesterday. These are incredibly wealthy societies. Why are they not spending at levels commensurate with the threat? I don't understand.
Well, and that level of, and the type of spending matters too, right? When our European allies talk about stepping up, it can't be for pensions.
Right, exactly.
In tough talk and percentages of increase for GDP don't win wars. Weapons do.
I want to move on. Last year, INDOPACOM admitted to Congress that it had the most unfunded priorities in its history, $11 billion. One of INDOPACOM's biggest shortfalls was missile defense. At the same time, we've been giving Patriot missile defense systems to Ukraine. We fired off hundreds of million-dollar missiles shooting down $1,000 Houthi drones. How wise is it to burn through our missile defense stocks in less important parts of the world when INDOPACOM is so desperately short of those weapons?
Well, I think, Senator, thanks. This is exactly the problem I'm pointing to. That's not to say that we shouldn't be doing anything in Europe or the Middle East. To the contrary, but it's to say if we all agree that China is the top challenge and China is the most formidable threat, we need to act like it, because especially given what Admiral Paparo and others are saying, and Bill Burns is saying, has been saying, that we need to act like this could actually happen. I agree with Secretary Rubio. There is a very real threat under President Trump's, in the term that he's been elected to, given the 2027 date, that God forbid a war could happen. And I agree that President Trump has said that China would not attack Taiwan under his watch. And if confirmed, I would make it my business, my particular business, to give him the military strength to back that up, coupled with the negotiating ability, Senator, that you just referred to.
Yeah, on that note, our Navy's not as big as it needs to be. We especially don't have enough Navy ships in the Pacific to counter China's rapidly growing fleet. Despite that, President Biden decided to permanently deploy more Navy ships in Europe to counter Russia, a nation which lost most of its Black Sea fleet to a country without a Navy. Mr. Colby, should we be putting more vessels in Europe when we already don't have enough in the Pacific?
Senator, I think we should be putting the military capabilities, especially that are relevant in the priority area, ships, submarines, missile defense assets, have to be focused on deterring a conflict over Taiwan. And if, God forbid, it happens, giving our soldiers and sailors and airmen and defenders and Marines the best shot. I mean, that's something I feel very deeply is I'm not in uniform, but if confirmed, it would be my job to make sure those who are in uniform or who do stand in harm's way, the best shot at winning, because the American military shouldn't get in a fair fight.
Thank you. I yield back.
Good. Let me go back to Taiwan very briefly. I would agree, and you talked about it earlier, it's the KMT, and it is the KMT, by the way. They control the legislature. It's different from the president's party. They're playing a dangerous game on their defense budget. And we all, if anyone from Taiwan is watching this hearing, they need to be, they need to realize they're playing a dangerous game, okay? Cutting defense spending right now is not the right signal. We all agree with that. As you know, the Taiwan Relations Act requires the U.S. to make weapons available to Taiwan for its defense. Every administration since 1979 has pledged to abide by that and has. The Trump administration did a great job its first term. If confirmed, will you work with us to make sure we're going to turn the Taiwanese around, but that we will commit to work with Taiwan and us to comply with the Taiwan Relations Act?
Yes, certainly, Senator, and even more than that, I would make it a special focus to accelerate and revamp and focus those capabilities and expand them, those weapons transfers and sales and so forth, to assist Taiwan in its ability to defend itself. So I've mentioned the pressure that we need to put on Taiwan. I think you're absolutely right, Senator, but we also need to do our part on the U.S. side to make real capabilities available in a timely fashion, which we've not done a good job on.
Get those weapons out there. I met with the previous president. She had a great statement to me when I talked about will, and she said will is often a function of training and capability. If you're stronger and you have weapons, we have this giant backlog, for example, of harpoons that we should be getting to the Taiwanese. So I think that's an important point that she made. Will is a function.
You have a final question.
need for strategic prioritization. I don't contest the fact that the Chinese are looking at what we're doing in Ukraine at all. But fundamentally, Senator, my view, and I think it should be of particular interest to this committee, sir, is that we have to have the military capabilities in Asia or relevant to Asia to be able to conduct a local defense of Taiwan at a cost and level of risk that the American people are prepared to tolerate. And that has been my main focus. My aspiration, if I would put another, and to kind of build on what the Vice President was saying, a longer-term top priority for me would be, if confirmed, would be to revivify our defense industrial base so that we are no longer in a position where our defense industrial base cannot produce at levels where we can resource in multiple theaters at the level that we need. That's where we want to get back to.
I want to turn briefly to Taiwan. You have said here today and in your past writings that Taiwan is a critical matter for us. You wrote in 2016 that you thought we should give explicit security guarantees to Taiwan, reversing a decades-old policy of strategic ambiguity. You opined in the same way in 2020 in response to a hearing in the House of Representatives. Over the past couple of years, you've started to say, as Senator Wicker pointed out earlier, that Taiwan is a vital interest, but it's not existential interest to us, or it's not essential to us. It seems that you have changed your thoughts somewhat in the last couple of years. That is not, I suspect, because of Taiwan's defense spending, which, though still inadequate, I agree, has been trending upward for 7 straight years. So could you explain to us why in the last few years your views seem to have softened somewhat about the defense of Taiwan?
Absolutely, Senator. I've always said that Taiwan is very important to the United States, but as you said, it's not an existential interest. It's very important. The core American interest is in denying China regional hegemony. What's changed, Senator, as we discussed, is the dramatic deterioration of the military balance. So if I could use the Churchill example again, it's different to engage in a futile and overly costly effort that would destroy our military. And I know you've written very eloquently about this danger in your recent book. And the other point that I would say, Senator, is that I believe that we actually have implicitly our relationship and our commitment to Taiwan is largely implicit or indirect or customary. We actually have specified our commitment through things like the designation of Taiwan as the pacing scenario for the department. So my view that the combination of the greater threat from China and the lack of preparedness on our part, I have a different assessment with respect, Senator, about Taiwan's efforts. I think actually as a proportion of GDP, it's well below 3%. I agree with President Trump that they should be more like 10%, or at least something in that ballpark, really focused on their defense. So we need to properly incentivize them. So together, that means that my focus has been, again, with the shooting the flare metaphor I used earlier, Senator, to get Taiwan motivated, to avoid precipitating a conflict that is not necessary with Beijing, and giving us time and space to be able to try to rectify this problem, because that is my goal, Senator.
Thank you.
Talk a little bit about your perspective on AUKUS, you know, the promise of the concept, and if there's practical skepticality, what that is.
Yeah, thank you very much, Senator. I appreciate that. And this is another area where, as I mentioned in my opening statement, where, you know, new facts arise. I mean, my perspective is fundamentally, I would say, realistic or pragmatic and kind of data-driven, if you want, adaptive, based on new facts. You know, the idea of empowering our Australian, in some sense, perhaps our closest ally in the world, they've been with us even in our less advisable wars, is the way I put it. It's a great idea for them to have attack submarines. But the problem is that we are, as you know, Secretary Rubio has said and others, there's a very real threat of a conflict in the coming years, God forbid, over, you know, along the first island chain. And our attack submarines, as you know well, Senator, are absolutely essential for making the defense of Taiwan or otherwise a viable and practical option, to my conversation with Senator Cotton. So if we can produce the attack submarines in sufficient number and sufficient speed, then great. But if we can't, that becomes a very difficult problem, because we don't want our servicemen and women to be in a weaker position and more vulnerable, and God forbid worse, because they're not in the right place in the right time. So my perspective, and what I've told the Australians and also the Brits, is, if confirmed, you know, or before, I think it should be the policy of the United States government to do everything we can to make this work. And again, as we talked about in your office, Senator, this is getting back to restoring our defense industrial capacity so that we don't have to face these awful choices, but rather can be in a position where we can produce not only for ourselves, but for our allies.
Just a note on Taiwan. To me, one of the critical questions is, how much is Taiwan committed to its own defense? It's disturbing to me that in recent months, the Parliament of Taiwan has moved to cut their defense budget. And how are we to be expected to think about sending Americans into harm's way on behalf of a entity that doesn't seem all that interested in protecting itself. Are you disturbed by that move in the Taiwanese parliament?
I'm profoundly disturbed, Senator, and I think the question that you're raising is one that I've heard not only Democrats but Republicans raise often in private. Secretary Mattis, who was mentioned earlier, said we can't care more about your defense than you can. So this is where I think I've been trying in my communication and my recommendations for policy vis-a-vis Taiwan to try to induce them in whatever way possible to become, say, more like South Korea. So it's a very plausible model with a much more serious military, because not only do I don't think it's fair to Americans to ask Americans and our servicemen and women to suffer at great if our allies are not pulling their weight, but also that it won't even be viable.
And you've written in your excellent book, Strategy of Denial, that we need to provide a credible deterrent in the Taiwan Strait to prevent China from achieving regional hegemony. But on deterrence itself, here's my question. Is deterrence divisible for the United States? And what I mean by that is, you know, when people say, well, we can let bad guys, Putin, roll in Europe, Iran, roll in the Middle East, but we're going to be strong in the Taiwan Strait. Is deterrence divisible in that way? I think it's not. Just look at Joe Biden, Afghanistan. Holy cow, that was a disaster. And guess what happened? And I predicted this. Every bad guy in the world was like, hey, I'm making my move. Putin probably would not have even invaded Ukraine had it not been for Afghanistan. Same with Hamas and Iran, with Israel. So is it, we got to rebalance, but is deterrence divisible? Because I think that's where you and I might have a little disagreement, and you get into the danger zone there. I don't think it is, but what do you think?
I think, Senator, that things are definitely interconnected, but what I'll say, and I recognize them over time, is that it's really important. I can't remember who said it, but you got to have the right stuff in the right place at the right time, and we need to make sure that we've got that. So we've got to do both of these things. We have to pay attention to the political credibility issues and how we're perceived, but at the end of the day, as you know well, given your distinguished military service, Senator, we need to have the right stuff in the right place at the right time to have the right effect. As I think Douglas MacArthur famously said, the two most infamous words in military history are too late, right? And I think that's really what that side of the equation is what I'm driving towards.
If you enjoy this content, please consider subscribing to my channel to stay up to date with future videos. Thank you for watching.